Fourth Gate. Today is day 20 of the Bible reading plan, and the chapters for today are Matthew 20, 1 Corinthians 4, and 1 Peter 2. So first, before I begin, I'm going to do a really quick summary of what happens in each chapter. In Matthew 20, Jesus is still very much so in the midst of his ministry before his death. He tells a parable of the workers in the vineyard. He predicts his death, I think, for the third time. He talks a little bit about heaven, while again foreshadowing his death. And then he brings sight to two blind men. In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul talks about what it's like to truly be an apostle. He mentions things like being servants of God, being stewards of his mysteries, being faithful in ministry, being careful not to get caught up in human judgment, being humble, and he also talks about the hardships that apostles and believers may face in each of their day-to-day lives. Paul tells the church in Corinth to imitate him as he imitates Christ, and he kind of calls himself their spiritual father. In 1 Peter 2, Peter speaks about growing and maturing in faith. He tells the reader to get rid of all of the evil within them. He mentions that we all are living stones and that we are being built and shaped around Christ, who is ultimately the cornerstone, the center. We are God's chosen people. He also challenges us to submit to human authority. He encourages us to keep going amidst the suffering and talks about how we should follow Christ's footsteps in suffering because of the suffering that he went through and what he endured. So, trying to think of a main idea and praying about it, I think these three passages emphasize how ultimately every walk with God is different, with different ups and downs, but how ultimately God has equipped us with his power to endure the suffering that we may face in each of our lives. When Jesus tells the parable of the workers in the vineyard, at the end, the workers are very upset and begin to complain that they all were paid the same, but they worked different hours. But Jesus says, so the last will be first and the first will be last. Again, later in the passage, Jesus says a similar statement. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Without God's power and strength, we cannot be this serving person that Jesus speaks about, who considers others before themselves. In our sinful nature, this statement might not make sense and does not seem fair. But when we look at the life Jesus lived, he embodied this serving person in each of his interactions. In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul speaks about the suffering followers of Christ may go through. Yet, even in the suffering and situations that don't make sense and may seem unfair, he says, when we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. I would say that this is definitely all possible for us to respond in this way because of the power that God has given us and that lives within us. When we're in suffering and hard situations, we still can faithfully endure and trust that he is in control and that he will have ultimate judgment because of his power that lives within us. Moving into 1 Peter 2, Peter speaks again about the suffering and what Christ has suffered for us. He says, for it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he trusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Christ suffered and overcame. It talks about the cross a little bit in this passage, and we actually have that same power living in us to overcome and endure the suffering that we may have in our lives. God's power lives in us, and that is what can ultimately guide and help us when difficult things come, when suffering seems to surround us, and when life just doesn't seem fair. I encourage you today to trust in the power that lives within you when facing difficult things this day and the coming days.